Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to the SCORE print ad. This is particularly useful for you if you are studying AQA A-Level Media Studies. This advert is a set text currently and will be asked about only ever in conjunction with media language, representation and contexts. So I will be going through this advert and just explaining it in a little bit more detail for you today. So this advert was made in the 1960s, in 1967, I think, and it's really quite reflective of the 1960s. The media language it used, if you just look at the amount of copy, the amount of writing that's on the advert, that's quite conventional for adverts that were made in that kind of middle part of the 20th century. Don't forget, people didn't have access to the internet then, and even TV was something that was still kind of reasonably new for people. So finding out more information about a product was quite hard if you were interested in it. So adverts tended to have quite a lot of copy on them in order to give the audience as much information about the product as possible. Whereas in the 1950s, a lot of adverts were illustrated, and even in the 1960s, some adverts were still being illustrated and kind of painted or drawn. This is using obviously large photos, and this idea of large photography for adverts was, still a reasonably new idea, and that would have made it seem quite exciting to audiences at the time. There's very clear image of the product and there's a repetition of the brand name throughout the advert. And that is really going to help to cement that brand in the audience's mind, give them a sense of familiarity and recognition. There is a kind of narrative element to this advert. There's a story being told here, this idea that if you use the product, you're going to look good. And if you look good, you're going to get the girls. So there's kind of a very clear message, if you like, to the audience of this advert about what will happen if they purchase it. There's the use of direct address within the advert. So it says things like, "You've always wanted," and "You get great grooming action." So that use of direct address is going to really draw the audience in, make it feel like the advert is really talking to them. They use words like new. The word new kind of really suggests that the product is high tech, it's really modern, and that might appeal to audiences who like to be the first person to get hold of a particular product. They also use the word famous within the advert as well, and that's going to engage a lot of audiences because it's going to make the product seem successful, and it's going to make it seem popular. And a lot of audiences really like the idea that if they buy a product, they too would become famous by default. They use the phrase "get what you've always wanted," which is a very not so thinly veiled pun or play on words. It's this idea that there's no subtlety here. Get what you've always wanted. Use this product, get the girls, be popular, be successful, get all the women. So it's creating this idea of a fantasy, a promise, if you like, to the audience, creating this idea that if they buy this product, then they can live this aspirational, fun, glamorous lifestyle where they will be the kind of popular and attractive person that everyone will be, drawn to. The word SCORE itself obviously has a lot of connotations, this idea of winning, success and dominance. But there is also this like double entendre, this kind of play on words, scoring with women or girls. So the use of that word as a brand name is quite interesting, very clearly suggesting to men that they are going to win. And in particular, they're going to win with women. The man is positioned in the middle, at the top, in the centre, and very much giving him this kind of status as being the most powerful person on the poster, making him kind of feel like quite heroic and dominant. Obviously, very conventional representation of men, particularly in the 60s. He's being carried and women are kind of reaching out for him adoringly. So creating this idea that he's almost godlike, he's being idolised, carried on their kind of shoulders. So really, really reinforcing this idea that men are to be respected and idolised and desired. Obviously appealing to a male target audience, but very much reflective of this 1960s context of a kind of patriarchal society where women were seen as more subservient and men were seen as more dominant. He's wearing quite an expensive looking watch, which makes him seem quite wealthy and successful. And have a look at the props as well. He's holding a gun, which kind of makes him seem quite powerful and aggressive. It's a kind of hunting style gun, which again makes him seem like a hunter. We often think of men being hunter-gatherers, this idea that they go out and take charge and they kill and they provide. So creating quite a stereotypical traditional representation of masculinity. The women are wearing quite revealing clothing, which makes them seem quite sexualized and objectified. It makes them feel like objects for a male audience. It creates this idea of a fantasy, and particularly because they're all positioned lower down on the advert, kind of gazing up at this man, it definitely makes them seem less important, more submissive, subservient, and very much objectifying women for a male target audience. Very conventional representation in the 1960s. Don't forget, in the 60s, we were having this idea of a sexual revolution. Women were becoming much more sexualized in the media. Despite the fact that feminism was on the rise at the time, this definitely does not reflect any feminist ideas. So there is some aspects that you could say do not reflect the 1960s, but there's a reason it's not going to reflect this, and that is because it's not aimed at women. It's aimed primarily at men, obviously, and therefore they are going to use much more traditional and kind of sexist imagery. All of the girls appear on the surface to be white. I know it's quite hard to tell somebody's ethnicity just by looking at them, but it does perhaps reflect the idea of the 1960s. Although Britain and America were becoming more culturally diverse, there was still very much a predominant focus on white ethnicity in the media, particularly in advertising, and so perhaps reflective of views about ethnicity in the 1960s. The fact that the man is armed and the women aren't, obviously reflective of male power, male aggression and violence, but also perhaps reflective of the fact that men were the ones that fought in the army at the time. There was no women, on the front lines. So audiences who would see this advert in the 60s may have lived through the First, Second World Wars, perhaps might have been living through things like the Vietnam War or other, elements of fighting around that time. And so might be more familiar to see a man with a gun because simply women, did not have access to those roles at the time. The setting is interesting. You've got lots of kind of trees and leaves, which make it feel quite tropical, almost kind of like jungly rainforest. And that would provide a certain amount of escape for audiences. It feels like an adventure, going to a kind of tropical country. It definitely doesn't feel like boring Britain. Adding this idea of a kind of escapist location and setting for audiences who might be craving adventure. The man holding a gun, a white man holding a gun in a kind of jungle setting really reinforces this kind of post-colonialist idea of the world, which was very common in the mid-20th century. This idea of white men going to other countries, foreign countries around the world, and exerting violence and power and control over people. And this idea of white dominance, British dominance over other people and other cultures was very much something that was happening at the time with the British Empire. So it really reflects that idea of kind of white superiority, if you like. A lot of men would have seen this advert and seen him as a kind of aspirational role model, somebody to look up to, an escapist idea where they could, want to live his life and have those women. And so it would have been seen as an aspirational product that would give them the kind of fantasy lives that they wanted. A lot of women may have enjoyed this advert at the time. I suppose this idea that they could have a kind of attractive male. But bearing in mind it was the 60s, there were probably a core group of women who would have looked at this advert and started to recognise the quite sexist undertones and overtones of the advert. So a lot of women within the 1960s may have not reacted well to this advert, but it wasn't targeted at them. Modern audiences, obviously, however, can see the kind of quite blatant sexism with the advert. And a lot of us now look at adverts like this with a kind of sense of humour as we realise how times have changed since the past. However, if you're studying media, you're probably well aware that times haven't changed that much. Adverts like this are still around. So that was my easy to understand guide to the score print advert. So don't forget to check out my channel. I'm adding more and more videos for all the exam boards now. If you're studying AQA, then there'll be a lot more coming up on my channel very shortly. So don't forget to hit subscribe. And if there's anything in particular you would like a video on or that I don't already have, just leave a comment below and I'll see what I can do.